I know where it will lead you, and what it will ultimately cost. As for your former colleagues, I can't wait to see what happens next. Today on the Comic Book Report, the X-Treme X-Men Omnibus Volume 1. Stick around and check it out. Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today we're taking a closer look at Chris Claremont's early 2000s X-Men series, The X-Treme X-Men. If you'd like to get your own copy or have other collected editions in mind, please check out our channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. Use code TheComicBookReport at checkout for $2 off your order today. If you use my code or affiliate links, I can earn a small commission. It's a great way to support the channel. Now let's get started with today's review. Here are some quick facts about today's collection. The issues in this volume were written by Chris Claremont and illustrated primarily by Salvador Larroca. The issues in this volume were published by Marvel Comics beginning in 2001. The volume itself collects Uncanny X-Men issue 389, X-Men issue 109, X-Treme X-Men issues 1 through 24, X-Treme X-Men Savage Land issues 1 through 4, X-Treme X-Men Annual 2001, X-Treme X-Men Expose issues 1 and 2, and material from X-Men Unlimited issue 36. And finally, this oversized hardcover collection comes in at 888 pages. At this time, I'd like to issue a brief spoiler warning. I will be flipping through the contents of today's collection and commenting on plot points throughout. You've been advised. Okay, and here's our first look at Chris Claremont's X-Treme X-Men Omnibus Volume 1 from Marvel Comics. As I mentioned at the top, this is an oversized hardcover collection, and it comes with glossy print pages. The cover I have is actually the direct market cover, but I'll be sure to throw up a picture of the standard edition so you can compare. As far as the spine goes, we have X-Treme X-Men stylized like the font title. I really enjoy that. It is one of those white spined omnibuses. I know not everyone likes that. I personally like the white as a change from all the black. As long as it has that Marvel Omnibus logo, I still think there's a level of uniformity on the shelf that I always enjoy seeing. Along the back, kind of like the Silver Age Omnis, we actually have little thumbnails of each of the issues included in the omnibus. I always love this feature. We don't always get it with more modern omnibuses, so I thought it was a nice facet of this dust jacket. Really made me excited to dive into the collection itself. Now, as I get ready to show you some of the under the dust jacket artwork, I'll first show you another quick closer look at the dust jacket itself. Like I said, I think it's really crisp looking. I really like the direct market cover. I think that and the standard are fairly similar. I probably prefer this direct market cover though, if I'm being honest. And underneath the dust jacket, we are treated to this awesome red print of a few of the X-Men characters. I find it curious that the front has Nightcrawler, Beast, and I think Jean Grey, as they're not really heavily involved in this series. Beast the most of these three, but even him kind of tangentially and maybe only in the beginning and toward the end. The back cover though has Storm and Rogue and Sage, which are definitely primary characters in this collection. Overall though, a great spread, and I love the kind of red background. It really just punches out at you when you take the dust jacket off. That with the white dust jacket, just a really beautiful exterior design for this omnibus. I was really happy with it. It's definitely one of the more distinct looking X-Men collections. And now we're just going to take a quick look at the binding of this omnibus. It is a sewn binding. Overall, I don't have a ton of complaints here. There might be a little bit of gutter loss, and you'll see that throughout the collection a bit. But overall, I was really pleased with it. There are a lot of two-page spreads in this book. There's an issue that even does it vertically, and I think that everything with the spine, everything with the binding, was pretty well done. I have no complaints as far as that goes. And with all of this out of the way, we'll finally dive into the collection proper. So let's go ahead and get started with X-Treme X-Men. The first few pages we have are just the traditional front matter. There's not a ton of a table of contents. There's kind of a creator breakdown that does show the issues, if not the page numbers. But overall, very good start. As far as what this collection is, I think something like anecdotally, they were making some new X-Men titles. Grant Morrison was going on to new X-Men. And I believe they gave Chris Claremont an option whether to continue or to start his own new X-Men book, and I think he opted to choose a new X-Men book, which is this one here, X-Treme X-Men. So this is a whole new X-Men team, and it has a very distinct mission and feel. I will say, prior to going into this book myself, I didn't know much at all about this title, about this run. I've really only read a lot of the earlier Chris Claremont stuff leading up into about the Mutant Massacre era so far. I have loved it. I've reviewed some of the other omnibuses and things from that era on my channel already, but I hadn't really delved this far into the latter era of Chris Claremont X books. I know that some people feel like a lot of his career bests are earlier in his history. I definitely understand what they're saying. I don't think that this goes toe-to-toe with some of those early Uncanny X-Men omnibuses or some of the event Uncanny X-Men omnibuses, but this one still really has a great feel, and there's enough Claremont-isms that I found this to be, a very satisfactory read. I had a very good time with this book. I had heard a lot of mixed to negative reviews about the title, so maybe take this all with a grain of salt, but as far as my opinion is concerned, I thought that this was a perfectly enjoyable read. As far as the context or general synopsis of this run goes, the essential storyline is early on in this book, they discover that the mutant Destiny, who at the time of the early issues in this run has been deceased for some time, we find out that before she passed away, she had actually written a sequence of, I believe, 13 diaries. These diaries were very scattered and in their own ways kind of encrypted and all over the place, but what they did do was foretell the future of mutant kind, of humanity, of the way the history was going to proceed. So there's a very real threat with these books. Obviously, if these fall into the wrong hands and they can kind of break the code and figure out how to interpret these diaries, especially once they're all collected together so it's easier to cross-reference and understand what's happening, it could pose a very real threat for the future of the world. And also, because of the nature of the powers these books would hold, Storm and the rest of the X-Treme X-Men team that begin to form are reluctant to give it to their mentor, Charles Xavier, believing that since he's already the world's most powerful telepath, they think giving him the opportunity for absolute power with all of these future diaries would potentially corrupt him. So they're kind of trying to keep it on the down low, away from their mentor, and opting instead to form this entirely separate team. I think initially when the book starts, the team is comprised of the leader, of course, Storm, with Bishop and Sage, along with Psylocke and Beast and Thunderbird, and lastly, Rogue. This is the main team for the beginning of the lineup. There are some changes and character shuffles throughout the book. One thing that happens on, I think, the second issue of X-Treme X-Men, so it's earlier in the collection, but again, spoiler alert for people that don't want critical details about the team. At the end of issue 2, Psylocke is actually murdered by one of the villains throughout this whole book, Vargas. Really sad. In the midst of that as well, Beast is really injured, and actually Sage uses her power to help activate his latent secondary mutation, which is where we actually get the feline-looking Beast that was really popular throughout Grant Morrison's new X-Men run. That event all kind of kicks off in this book and during those issues. Because of that, though, obviously Psylocke is no longer on the team, and Beast actually transitions over into the new X-Men after that. As far as people that join the team throughout the book, Gambit, while not officially a member for most of it, does dabble in and out of this book to the extent where I'd actually consider him a primary character in this omnibus. Additionally, we also get characters like Slipstream, who is a new mutant that shows up, as well as Lifeguard. There's a few other character shifts and changes throughout the book, but this is really your cast of characters. Having read, obviously, earlier Claremont era and other situations where Storm leads an X-Men team, I felt right at home reading her as the lead of this new group, the X-Treme X-Men, and overall, I had a ton of fun with it. I think one of the major draws for me is I have always wanted to read more with Rogue and Gambit, specifically Rogue and Gambit together, kind of coupled romantic. I know they're like a sweeping, great superhero couple in the world of the Marvel Universe, and I've only dabbled with them here and there. In fact, so far, one of my main exposures to the two of them was actually in the Excalibur run that came out in this Krakoa era. I reviewed the first volume of that on my channel, and they were okay, but I much preferred their characterizations here in this book. It's also an interesting time with the character of Rogue. This is an era where she used to be able to, touch someone, gain their powers and some of their psyche and memory and things like that, but eventually that power would sort of fade. In this era, though, she actually is losing control of her powers. They're kind of overcharged and getting chaotic, where she has all of the psyches screaming for her attention. She has access to all the powers, but sometimes they're shuffled. Sometimes she loses access to given powers that she wish she didn't, like all the stuff she absorbed from Carol Danvers. And it just makes her character very unstable throughout. I really liked that, though. It added a lot of chaos to the team and to that character specifically, and there was a lot of issues in this that I felt like were really a character exploration of Rogue and what it meant to be that character, with or without her powers, or to what degree the powers influenced her character and so forth. It asked a lot of great questions, and I was along for the ride throughout the entire run. And when I say run, I should probably clarify, I mean the run within this omnibus. Like I mentioned at the top, this is a volume 1. I believe looking at the roster for issues for X-Treme X-Men, this is probably volume 1 of a potential 2 set here. I think volume 2 would finish out the rest of this run. I really hope this was popular enough to warrant a volume 2, as I would sincerely enjoy reading it. I really liked this book. I do think that where it ended was a good kind of cap for those that wanted to be one and done with this and to kind of jump off. I think you can really do that at the end of this collection. It doesn't cliffhang you too bad. The last issue actually kind of bridges into what I assume will be kind of the new version of the X-Treme X-Men team. So I feel like once we hit volume 2, it will really feel like a new chapter in this run, rather than being cliffhanged and feeling like you're right in the middle of something. I do think that this volume 1, if not conclusive, it felt like enough loose ends were tied up within this singular volume that you had a kind of unified single experience, and I really liked that as well for this book. So I gave you kind of the brief overview of those Diaries of Destiny. Like I said, the X-Men team I think has 1 or 2 at the beginning, and they kind of see sort of these different prophecies coming true, and they realize the threat that this could carry. The main villain that's trying to thwart them and get the diaries for himself is this character Vargas, who is, I think, a humanoid that has mutant-like abilities. It's really a little muddled, but it sounds like it's another branch of humanity that he's kind of believing he can be empowered and kind of be humanity's kind of primary evolution, as opposed to the mutation that we've seen with the mutant characters, the X-Men, things like that. But this character is on basically a killing spree, trying to wipe out a lot of these X-Men characters and to gather the diaries for himself. So he kind of comes in and out of this collection. He is really the primary menace for most of this book, but I feel like his kind of villainy peaked maybe at the beginning of the collection, which I'm almost sorry to say, right around that issue 2 with the death of Psylocke and where Beast got maimed. I think that was where he was most menacing. He has some other notable appearances and some resolutions, at least in this volume, as we get toward the middle and back end of the book, but I think he really peaked a little bit early. I think that his character was definitely creative, but not the most noteworthy X-Men villain out there. After that whole diary-like plot line, which is, again, recurrent throughout most of the volume, another one we have is a 4-issue Savage Land miniseries. This has a different art style in it, and it kind of is a self-contained little 4-issue arc where basically the mutants are trying to deliver these kind of reptilian creatures, these reptilian humanoid sort of creatures, to the Savage Land as a kind of sanctuary after their population has been mostly destroyed. While they're in the Savage Land, though, there's sort of a race war and kind of a kingdom war and clash over in the Savage Land, and there's a lot of really interesting plot lines there. They tried to devolve Storm at one point and make her sort of a beast, an animal. Beast himself, who's on the team for this instance, is also kind of appears to be under the sway of this villainous kind of animalistic humanoid creature as well. Very interesting story arc. It had a couple fun moments, but overall, that was definitely not the top of this collection for me. Outside of those, we also had a plot line with this alien race with a leader named Khan. I really like this storyline as well. I think that this was sort of the climax of the collection. For a while, everything kind of built up to this. It even incorporated some of the Diaries of Destiny. And I feel like after the resolution of this Khan storyline, everything kind of felt like the falling action. I felt like everything was sort of tying up the loose ends and transitioning into the next volume overall. So that storyline revolves around something in Madripoor happens where basically an other dimensional portal opens up using Gambit as sort of a doorway. and it basically opens the door to this empire builder named Khan, who's trying to come over and sort of take the world as a sort of Alexander the Great, imperialistic conqueror kind of person. He has done this before in worlds past, but now he's coming for Earth. Along the way, however, he falls in love with Storm, and there's this kind of weird romance he's trying to have, while Storm is just trying to keep her planet safe. But anyway, this was, I would consider, the main big storyline at the end of this book. I really loved it. I thought the resolution was awesome. A lot of great action. The way that they weaved a lot of the different sub-characters in and out was very fun. And the only major plotline afterwards, they had an expose two-parter, which was sort of exploring sort of the PR of the X-Men and the X-Treme X-Men. This is around the era where the mutants are sort of outed to the general public. They find out that Professor X's school is sort of a mutant facility. This is, I believe, handled in the new X-Men era over on Grant Morrison's side of the fence, but it really affects these mutants as well. And those two issues were actually really well done. A lot of commentary on what it means to be human and humane. Really enjoyed those two issues. It was kind of a good sort of palate cleanser and breathing room after a lot of heavier story arcs. One of the final stories as well we had with Bishop and I believe Sage. It was sort of a murder investigation where the primary suspect appeared to be a child who was actually at the Xavier school, which is now under the kind of running of Emma Frost. That was an interesting story. It felt really more like a detective crime thriller, which was a really fun change of pace with all the other things going on in this book. That arc was, I think, only 2 or 3 issues as well. Really well done. That was at the later end of the collection, but like I said, after the big battle with Khan, all of these other storylines felt a little bit smaller, but overall, really fun. The final issue in the collection has to do with Cannonball from the New Mutants appearing to want to join the X-Treme X-Men team. It almost felt like a one-shot and sort of a preamble for what comes next. I think that was all the main storylines and issues included. There was one somewhere in the middle about Kitty Pryde and her losing her father and other loved ones. That was actually a really good little issue in there. I think that was part of one of the other X-Men books. And additionally, there was an issue or two at the front from some of the other X-Men books kind of setting up where the status quo of the X-Men and the mutants and all these teams are that paved the way for the formation of X-Treme X-Men. So I think that is sort of a just bird's eye synopsis of a lot of the main storylines and sort of contents of this book. Like I said, overall, very happy with a lot of the narratives overall. I thought the villains were really fun. I didn't see a lot of familiar faces, and I think that there was a real novelty to that. Characters like Khan and Vargas, and even that sort of kid that ended up being sort of a murderer, that whole thing, these were all kind of new creations, new characters, and it was kind of nice not to just pull out Magneto again, so to speak, as much as I love Magneto. That being said, however, I don't feel like any of the villains ever hit a fever pitch of something that was so commendable and noteworthy that I would revisit again and again and again. There's a reason I haven't seen much from these characters since then, I'm sure, but as sort of one-and-done villains, I thought that they were really great, and it was refreshing and different, and I really enjoyed that. As far as the art style we saw in this book, a lot of the art is provided by Salvador Larroca. I think what's interesting with the style in this book is it doesn't look like there's a ton of inking, so the actual images are a little like out of focus or soft at the edges in some way. Out of focus is not the right word. The images are sharp and reproduced correctly. It's just more of the edges of the character models are not well defined by a strong, hard line, if that makes sense. So it adds a kind of dreamy, surreal quality to the images. And while this wasn't maybe my favorite art style, it was something very distinctive and something unique about this collection. And I did like that. I feel like the art really stood out to me because of that, and it really separated itself from other books' art at the time. Also, being someone who's read a lot of the modern Benjamin Percy X-Force stuff, I really also like seeing stuff with Sage. My knowledge base of X-Men is growing. It's growing a lot this past year as I'm finally diving into this franchise as a whole, but it is a huge, just incredible undertaking to try to understand the entire X-Men universe. So my first exposure to Sage that I was aware of was in the pages of that new X-Force run from Benjamin Percy in the last couple years. So I was really excited to see her appear appearances in this book. She is a very prominent character, and this is a time where she was really new to sort of the X-Men family, and a lot were so mistrusting of her as kind of Xavier's spy in the Hellfire Club, and I really thought that that was really interesting, and it added so much more layering to this character for me that makes me want to revisit some of the more modern stuff with X-Force to see just the resemblance of today's Sage versus some of this early era Sage. Really great character throughout. I thought she added a lot of good conflict and some rich character development in a lot of ways. She definitely fueled a lot of just fights within the team as far as how she activated latent mutant ability in some people. But overall, really liked that. I thought Bishop was also a nice inclusion. We get to see him basically playing a cop. He sort of just masquerades as sort of a federal officer wherever he goes. A lot of this book takes place in like Australia, I think. We have some of it taking place in New Orleans. But again, wherever they go, he's just kind of saying he's a federal officer. I think he was a cop of some kind in the future maybe, but it's just really fun seeing what he does. He's just sort of a hard-edged sort of law enforcement kind of personality type, and I like to see how that meshed with the team. Like I said, I think some of my highlights were Rogue and Gambit and their relationship throughout this. I really thought the characters were sweet, and they also were really rich in conflict themselves, and I think that they were some of the most interesting and well-developed in this collection. Storm was always pretty solid. I don't think that she had a ton of shining moments here. Maybe some of how she defeated Khan was pretty highlight, and how she dealt with the repercussions of the injuries she sustained throughout that storyline. I did like that as well. But there were some lackluster moments. I think the inclusion of some of the newer mutants like Lifeguard and Slipstream were just kind of okay. I think they were hit and miss with me. They tried to make Lifeguard sort of a descendant of the Shi'ar Empire while also being the descendant of like a mob boss. And it was just sort of like putting a hat on a hat to me. I think that they put a little too many layers on some of the new characters that it really bent my suspension of disbelief maybe a little bit further than it could handle. I think overall there was a kernel of like really great character work with some of those new characters, but overall they fell a little flat to me. I was much more interested in some of the other pre-established mutants. Overall impressions to me, like I said, I think that this was definitely a fun read. I had a blast going through this collection. I would absolutely read a volume 2. I think some of my bigger drawbacks are some of the characters maybe didn't work for me. Some of the villains were fun that they were new and not just a constant retreading of some of X-Men's highlight reel villains, but maybe they were a little bit lackluster. They didn't have as much of the staying power, certainly the legacy of some of those other characters. And I think overall, the kind of feel I have was these were really fun stories. I would definitely revisit this collection. I would read these stories again. But I wonder how many of these will hold up with even longer tests of time as classic stories. I think the most noteworthy in this whole collection is probably X-Treme X-Men issue 2 with the death of Psylocke and the injuring of Beast. I do feel like that had the most lasting implications on this whole X-Men universe. I know Psylocke did come back, Beast, these things kind of worked themselves out in time, but for some time, this was a definitive moment in the history of these characters, and probably still is, even with Psylocke being back from the dead. I think overall, that was a really impactful issue that I think that when people think of X-Treme X-Men, they will most undoubtedly think of that issue. Beyond that, though, I'm not sure how well known this series is or will be. I really enjoyed all the stuff with Khan and that sort of that alien, other dimensional like invasion storyline. I would put that up there with one of just my top maybe 20 X-Men stories I've ever read. I really did enjoy it. But this is not a Days of Futures Past. This is not a Dark Phoenix saga. This is not, you can rattle off so many great X-Men stories, even modern ones like House of X, Powers of 10. This is nowhere near that ballpark for me, but this was a really fun run. I think that the team was very eclectic and a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and I liked that sort of hodgepodge collection of a team. I'm actually impressed with the collection of mutants that they had, that this book sold for as long as it did. I think that Storm, Rogue, and Gambit are probably the main sellers on this book, but I'm really impressed that they were able to have a really good narrative and team from these characters, because we don't have Wolverine show up a ton. We don't don't have some of the heavy hitter mutants beyond those couple I mentioned, and to have a team that was coherent, had a really good strong team dynamic, and have a book that has a distinctive feel like this that's sold enough to continue it on for some time, I think that that's really noteworthy, especially in the history of X-Men. This was a team I wasn't aware of a few months ago, and it's one I'm delighted to know now. There's an interview, some sketches, covers, and some different miscellany in the back for extras, but that's about it for this X-Treme X-Men collection. All that's left now is to give this omnibus a grade. While this may never be the most essential classic X-Men book out there, this eclectic team certainly had something to bring to the table. I was charmed by the unique visual style that lacked some of the inking, and overall it was fun to see a bunch of new villains that I had never read before. For these reasons and more, the Comic Book Report is happy to give the X-Treme X-Men Omnibus Volume 1 by Chris Claremont and Salvador Larroca a B. This is an above average collection for me and a read that was absolutely worth it. I look forward hopefully for the Volume 2 that can round out the back half of this run, and I'm happy to say I was entertained by this read throughout. If you read X-Treme X-Men, definitely let me know what you think in the comments below, especially if you read the later half of this run. I'm definitely interested to hear. And that's going to do it today. Until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to leave your comment, your like, and maybe check out some of my other videos. Until next time, have a good one.